Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Kinto, the safety-first L2, which is accelerating the transition to the on-chain financial system. They've got some very cool features like user-owned KYC and native account abstraction, which solves a bunch of the onboarding and bottleneck problems that many L2s suffer from. So you're going to be hearing all about them later in the program, but if you want to learn more and better, if you want to join their launch program, Engen, E-N-G-E-N, you can click the link at the bottom of this episode. Go check them out. Tell them I sent you.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. This is the second interview episode of the restaking season, and I'm joined here by my trusty co-host, Miles O'Neill. We have got a veritable power panel here today. We're going to be talking about liquid restaking. We've got Clayton from Rio, Sam from Skip, and Krane, who is working on some Bitcoin stuff. So everyone, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Hello.
Hey, guys, this is going to be a great episode, and we've got a ton of material to work through. So maybe just to, tee it up here, I thought we could just start by talking about the history and rise of LRTs to date, so to speak. So, obviously very broad, a lot of ways, different ways that we could take this, but Krane, maybe I could turn it over to you. Give us a little bit of the history here and talk to us about some of the market conditions that led to the current state of liquid restaking.
Yeah, so maybe let's start with the idea of staking and restaking in the first place, and then sort of how we get here. So staking in the Ethereum context is just you providing your ETH as security to the network, doing a set of services for the network, in exchange getting some yield. And if you don't do the services well, or if you're malicious, you get slashed. So you take on some risk for this yield. Restaking is basically just a generalization of this concept where you can opt into doing more services for the network for the same ETH, so you can get more yield. And in return, what happens is you take on more risk of slashing by doing this extra set of services that Eigen Layer is calling AVSs. Doesn't really matter. And in the bear market, the only thing that was available to people was ETH staking yield. So LSTs basically became super common. What was not available on Ethereum back in 2022 was any kind of delegation system. So what happened was Lido provided this service where you could put your ETH in Lido smart contracts, and what Lido did for you was delegate the ETH to a bunch of operators. These operators ran staking infrastructure, and in return you got some yield. The operators also took a fees off of the yield that they were generating for you. And this delegation system plus Lido's ST-ETH receipt voucher became super common across all of DeFi. People started using it a bunch, and it was sort of the risk-free yield in DeFi. And people became super familiar with ST-ETH. There's no actual discount on ST-ETH versus ETH. So people sort of assume that Lido is basically a no-risk protocol or a very low-risk protocol. And once restaking happened, restaking looks very similar to staking in the sense that people put their money in a contract and then it secures a bunch of networks. And as soon as this opportunity came to basically secure more networks, earn more yield, people started jumping on this Eigen Layer bandwagon. And what Eigen Layer didn't have as well was this delegation system where basically you could give the money to someone else, and this someone else could opt into AVSs for you, run the infrastructure for you. Eigen Layer also had caps on the liquid staking tokens that you could put into the Eigen Layer contracts. So what happened was some LRTs started basically coming in with native staking, native restaking, where they basically provided the infrastructure to run staking nodes for you. So I think Renzo's go-to-market was this, where they basically ran staking infrastructure for you, and through that created a delegation system on top of Eigen Layer. So you don't just get you don't have to wait for the caps to be raised every single time Eigen Layer decides to do so. What you can do is delegate to something like Renzo, and then you get get this like easy ETH receipt voucher that looks very similar to Lido. So like you had this like market structure where Lido like basically became the delegation example on the staking side. On the restaking side, like a lot of these LRTs started basically coming in with a GTM that basically became the delegation platform for people to use Eigen Layer.
And Clayton, maybe I'll pick on you since you're at Rio now, but you were at Figment prior to that, and I think Krane, you just did a great job of kind of like laying out a lot of the constraints facing end users that made LRTs really attractive. But I think there were also some, I guess maybe even regulatory concerns for operators too that made LRTs an attractive way to actually get delegations. And this is something you guys called out, I think, even like last June, that might be a problem for operators. I'll let you kind of like unpack the details, but
yeah, I mean, ever since Eigen Layer's design was public, and previously at Figment, we were taking a look at it fairly heavily in January of last year. But if you're looking at the relationship between staking versus restaking, just to simplify the actors or things that are in the system, staking, you have protocol, validator, token holder. The validator and the token holder can be the same. The protocol can be any proof of stake protocol. Restaking, you have protocol, validator, token holder, a selection of AVSs, and then an AVS strategy. And currently, the operator is effectively the strategy manager on Eigen Layer. And most operators don't want that responsibility, nor can they legally probably have that responsibility if they wanted to stay in business. So the LRT design was actually beneficial because as Eigen Layer grew and interest, these operators can kind of offset that strategy manager role to an LRT, and that LRT has a bunch of different go-to-market strategies. I mean, there's 6 or 7 fairly large ones in the market at this point in time. And they're, effectively the distribution, partner for these node operators, similar to Lido in that way, right? A lot of node operators are not going to be releasing a receipt token that's completely bound by them as well on the staking side. So in that regard, on the operator side, LRTs were very, very important to the initial ability for node operators to get stake on Eigen Layer in a way that was, at least at some capacity, more compliant than building your own restaking strategy in-house.
Right, and that points to both the selection of the AVSs that you're restaking to, or you're restaking to on behalf of the end user, and the capital allocation, more importantly, right? Which is really non-core for operators, I think. But yeah.
I mean, I think to compare it to staking Ethereum, obviously there's a lot you can do to change the reward rate, or increase the security based off the infrastructure that you're running, but you're not really doing anything else with the asset, right? Like you can leverage some sort of MEV strategy, or have the Flashbot sidecar in place, have the nodes in certain locations, etc. But you're really not changing the risk reward profile of the stake position. Every time you're adding an AVS, someone can argue that you're doing that on behalf of someone, which does make it naturally more complex, which leads to the rise of whether it becomes an LRT or something else, the role of a strategy manager in any sort of staking ecosystem versus a staking ecosystem, and its potential on being a very profitable business long term, whether there's a receipt token or not, because you're effectively doing the risk framework for all of these positions. And there's $15-16 billion restaked on Eigen Layer right now.
Maybe I could just add one small point that rounds out this kind of like rise of LRTs, which is during the bear market, there obviously was many protocols were struggling to kind kind of find users, raise, etc. So all the air was kind of sucked out of the room, and many of the current LRT providers were LST providers that then saw an opportunity in restaking as kind of the dominant narrative. And similarly for AVSs, which may have been DeFi protocols or infrastructure protocols that maybe kind of didn't get the timing right, and now leaning into the AVS. I mean, there is, I think, real value provided there, but it also is kind of a shelling point for the ability to raise and kind of plug into a capital base or a user base.
So can we talk a little bit about the actual delegation vouchers or receipt themselves? And that's actually a little bit about that exact phrase, Krane, that I think that you used as a callback to the original liquid staking paper that Felix Lutch, originally of Chorus One, wrote way back in the day. And Miles and I have talked about a little bit about this as well in the liquid staking season, about this like very winner take most market structure for liquid staking tokens, where they're trying to compete against actually the underlying asset of the network. So ETH, they're trying to compete in terms of liquidity, like moneyness, whatever that word means to you, et cetera. And it's because underneath, what these validators are all doing is very homogenous and pretty vanilla. It's pretty different characteristics underneath the hood for these other types of delegation vouchers or receipts, these liquid restaking receipts, much more heterogeneous under the hood. So can you guys just describe a little bit about the different dynamics that you expect in between these liquid restaking tokens versus LSTs?
I mean, I think the main difference is the amount of variability that these LRTs can have in terms of reward rate and risk. Really, back to the point of not being able to do much with the yield on staking ETH. Really, the goal, I mean, if you're going back all the way to Lido, right? Some folks were staking ETH for over 1.5 years before withdrawals were enabled. So that concept of liquidity was super valuable in November of 2021. But then once withdrawals are enabled, the entry queue, the exit queue is relatively low, and time period. Really, what you fight for on the LST side is the moneyness and how much it's integrated on the DeFi side, and where you can buy it, sell it, etc. LRTs, like the variability, depending on how much people actually leverage Eigen Layer for security, could range multiples from 5% to 15% to 20%, always additional bells and whistles attached to them, right? And so I don't know if it's going to be a winner take most in this market, especially understanding that institutions and other risk averse people likely aren't here yet depositing significantly into Eigen Layer. But there's probably going to be a handful of low risk, moderate, high risk LRTs that will gain dominance in those three buckets.
Yeah, and I think.
Go ahead, Krane.
Okay, so I think also just because of these choices that the LRT protocols can make, right? So the first choice is which AVSs to stake to or restake to, how much to restake to each AVS. And then there's also this third component, which I think goes back to Clayton's variability point, is the rewards, right? You might get rewards in 5 different tokens if you're staking to 5 separate AVSs. And now what you do with the reward changes the variability of the underlying quite a bit, right? And also changes the shape of what your LRT looks like. The receipt voucher might just be made up of ETH if the protocol just keeps on selling the rewards that it earns. But then AVSs might not like the protocol too much because they keep on selling the reward tokens that they get. And on the other hand, if the LRT sort of holds these tokens, then it looks a lot less like money, right? Because if you have this receipt voucher that's backed by not just ETH but 5 other assets, then the liquidity of the other assets determines the liquidity of the receipt voucher as well. So I think the receipt voucher term is more correct for LRT protocols today to some extent, mostly because I think they don't all need to be liquid tokens. They can be somewhat illiquid, and then the sort of receipt token that you get is just a claim to the underlying instead of like being the same kind of money that LSTs were attempting to be.
Right. And I guess, so what are the sort of implications of that? Because we've already seen LRTs started to be used in DeFi. I think a lot of them are going after the same playbook as Lido in terms of finding like, utility channels, whether it's DeFi collateral or gas on L2, right? I think like Swell is the first one to come out with their own L2 that's using an LRT as gas, or at least the bridge deposit token. And to me, it feels, I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but it does feel like the network effects are lower, just given the heterogeneity across these assets, and also like what the end users actually want, right? Because they're not all the same. So you're not just going to be judging based off of, how liquid is this? How many places can I use it, right? They're actually very different sort of value props depending on what they do. And, I think we've talked about this in a previous episode, but I'm curious if you guys agree that like, this market structure ends up looking a lot more fragmented, or at least at the receipt token level, right? Maybe not at the entity level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The other component of this is just what do the AVSs do? Like, what is the technical capability that you get out of this, and what is it plugging into? So, is it a shared sequencer that's like serving, a specific rollup architecture, or is it a pre-conf system? Like there's an opportunity to create some kind of like technical supercomposability or like cluster of related services. I don't think anybody really knows what that looks like yet, but you could imagine kind of sectors or specializations that LRTs are. They have domain knowledge and just kind of a core set of assets that interact with each other in a favorable way. And they may have a specific customer set, an L2 or another chain that they're serving, and it might be a distribution channel to access that specific customer base.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Kinto, the safety-first L2 with user-owned KYC and native account abstraction that is accelerating the transition to the on-chain financial system. Now, we've been talking about Larry Fink on this program and how he's been shouting the good word about tokenization to all of his buddies on Wall Street. This is happening. And the very cool part about Kinto is that they are built to accept a whole bunch of assets and a whole bunch of users from the traditional financial system, which current L2s have done an okay job, but there's a lot of room for improvement for onboarding. So it features very nice things like user-owned KYC and native account abstraction that solve some of the biggest blockers around mainstream adoption, namely security and user experience. You can become a founding member at engen.kinto.xyz. If you believe in this on-chain financial system, join Kinto's launch program and thank me later. Cheers, guys. And the link, bottom of this episode, click it now. What do you guys, when we're looking at maybe the demand side of the market for liquid restaking, what do you guys, it sort of feels like on the supply side of the market, this is a really easy story. Oh, I can take my liquid staking token that I'm getting yield on, dump it into a platform and get even more yield. Sign me up. There's an enormous amount of capital, as we know in crypto, that's willing to do that. The demand side of the market is very interesting to me. And maybe we could talk a little bit about, there's sort of two sides of this market, which is kind of like exporting ETH security. So the external part of that market. And then Krane gave Miles and I some feedback on our first episode where we're rebranding endogenous to feature edition. So what we're saying is we're looking at the ETH validator set, saying, hey, these guys are doing, some things as stipulated by the protocol. Maybe smaller quorums or subsets of those validators could opt into doing additional tasks. And underneath the hood of all of this capital that's pouring into the restaking ecosystem, there are both of those things happening. So can we just, for folks who aren't as deep in the weeds and the overall size of this market, like maybe could, whoever wants to take this, like how large, I guess, is both like sort of the external part of this market, like how many AVSs, what's like the order of magnitude of like lift of yield that we're going to see here for ETH. And then maybe we could talk a little bit about the market size for the feature edition part of the market as well.
Yeah. And maybe one thing I would call out is we talk about this, we're calling it feature additions to Ethereum, like pseudo feature additions, when you have the operator set opting in to do additional jobs outside of just proposing valid blocks. I think tying that back to LRTs, moment take in a number of different assets, right? They take in LSTs and they take in native ETH. I think it's worth calling out that you need native ETH staking in order to access any sort of, feature addition like use case for restaking, right? If you have a bunch of LSTs as your collateral, you actually don't, you can't control what those validators are doing, right? If you have stETH, that's really up to the stETH validators to decide. It's just an interesting call out, and maybe that's part of why over time LRTs will try to convert like a lot of the LSTs that have been deposited into the protocol into native stake. Speculation, but
there's also the revenue component there, right? Like if you are natively staking, then you can take the 10% that Lido does off of the ETH staking yield as well. So there's like not just like technical reasons, but also just completely business reasons to actually do native staking yourself.
Yeah, if you look at it from the depositor side, like I could see this thing turning into almost like the difference between your like checking account and your savings account and your bank. Like maybe there's a intermediate entity that's like doing kind of risk adjusted yield in a relatively safe way, and like literally everyone has it. They have some money in their savings account. From the AVS side, like how many AVSs could there be? I think there's just nobody really knows the answer to that question. Like, are there going to be a million chains? Like AVSs are pretty much chains or like microservices at the end of the day. Like there could be a lot of them. A lot of them could just, could produce almost no yield. They're just kind of almost operating at cost. I assume there will be some kind of power law there where there's like some pretty valuable AVSs, and at that point, they might split off and become their own protocols. I'm kind of coming from Cosmos, so I think part of my like base assumption is that there will be many chains, and yeah, some of them will absolutely be AVSs. There's kind of one further question is how many kind of aggregate to Ethereum or Bitcoin or Solana or whatever, and how I view that is it's kind of part of this like alignment question, which is really like a integrating into the user base, integrating into liquidity, integrating into the kind of marketing pipeline of these different projects.
I think looking at the demand side specifically in terms of engaging with these LRTs, I mean, in the short term, it does make getting security easier. Like 70% of market share on Eigen Layer is done through LRTs, and a majority of that is done through like 3 of them. So, if you want billions of dollars of economic security, whether you need it at this point or not, or it's a good vanity metric to have, or it's good to align with these burgeoning staking, liquid restaking protocols. It's easy to go knock on 3 doors for billions of dollars of economic security. That is a fairly new thing that a protocol can do. I mean, to Sam's point of there being potentially 100+ chains in the Cosmos ecosystem, bootstrapping a validator set in the Cosmos will take months. You have to go source 50, 70, 100 sophisticated operators, and then find a way to get stake on them, whether they be through some sort of token distribution moment to the community, and then encouraging them to stake to the right people, or some foundation delegation program. Like an AVS can spin up right now and get $5 billion worth of ETH by picking up the phone for 3 LRTs. That being said, I think that this being a marketplace, and this being, a publicly viewable marketplace, and in the long run, you wouldn't necessarily have to do that if the incentives are in place from an ABS perspective when looking for stake. If you're a protocol that's earning $10 million in revenue, and you're giving that to operators on Eigen Layer on a yearly basis, you're not going to have to call them, right? There's just going to be, some risk frameworks in place on a website. There's going to be a place to, start, validating that ABS, and the rewards are going to start entering your wallets and your stakers' wallets. So I think this phenomenon of like these LRT, deals and stuff will likely go away. Although, that being said, there's still, this is just an evolved concept when, you announce Coinbase Cloud or Figment or a large node operator supporting your testnet in the early stages. I think having this LRT backing will still be significant for some ABSs, especially ABSs that are potentially layer 1 or roll up ecosystems that would love to partner with that on that protocol on the liquidity side of things as well.
I'm not totally sure I agree. You think that structured deals are going to go away? I think they'll become more ingrained in the protocol, but I don't think they're going to go away. I think they're going to get more sophisticated.
I think if there's like a time lock mechanism that you can do on chain or something to where this is maybe more public. I think the issue with being a DAO and potentially not disclosing the information and then restaking for some benefit, that part will go away. I think a lot of these agreements on, do we allocate 20% to this ABS? This ABS is going to reward us for XYZ for being there for a year. That will continue, but it will be more public and people will have knowledge over it, and people will decide to vote on both ends of the system.
Clayton, I'm actually curious, what is the incentive to make that more public? I mean, these just sound like sort of sensitive commercial agreements to me. Like, who's incentivized to put that on chain or make that publicly available?
I mean, just thinking from an idealist perspective, it's these open systems that everyone should be participating in, especially people that either have stake in the system or people that plan to use the ABS, right? So like both of these have both sides of the marketplace will likely have on-chain treasuries, DAOs, ecosystem incentives, etc. You as a depositor on the staking side or owner of the governance token or some consumer of an ABS will want to know how that's money is being spent, right? So I think for better for worse in terms of like the strategy for the people closer to the protocol, in the long run, a lot of this should be public.
Yeah, and it touches on a competitive dynamic that exists in LRTs that doesn't exist in regular staking, which is that the ABSs want to cap the amount of security that they have. They want a number that they think is sufficient, and it basically satisfies what they need on the security side, but it's also low enough that they can pay what is required to satisfy the constraints of the operator side and the LRTs. And so what could happen, and what we're already seeing happening, is that there are some LRTs that just are unable to deploy like the assets that have been deposited to them to restaking, because they're looking across the AVS landscape and saying, okay, well, all of the really high quality AVSs that we have relationships with, they've hit their cap already, right? And to be fair, there's actually nothing really stopping these LRTs from depositing to those AVSs at the moment. There's nothing on chain that's stopping them, but it's more of I think, kind of a just good business practice not to do that. If you tell them that you're, okay, we got our like 50 million out of the billion that you said you wanted, and that could lead to LRTs, with maybe more like thicker designs, right? If you have a bunch of deposits sitting around that are not being put to work because there are not there's no availability within the high quality AVSs, maybe you start looking at other value added services, or maybe you just throw them into Compound, right? Or some other sort of yield generating protocol. And then this thing starts looking, less and less like an LST. And Sam, I know you've thought a lot about this, and you had a great piece around like what we'll call it like a thick LRT design could look like one day. So maybe I'll let you expand on that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this kind of gets back to the age-old staking versus lending trade-off here, right? Like the LRTs are either going to lose that capital because they're not paying out that depositor base, or they need to do something with it. Like that's either attracting more AVSs or lending it somehow. So they could put it in Compound, like you said. The piece that I wrote along with Max, our suggestion was, well, there's actually some interesting things that you could do with this excess capital. If AVSs are going to launch a token, you want initial liquidity on that token. That's actually really important, so that if you're selling your token in order to pay the operators, you're not just dumping the price. So you could create initial liquidity pools, and then there's this just kind of opens up a design space of like, okay, well, maybe we want to create some way of servicing duration within the protocol, so we can actually say, hey, we'll give you liquidity for 6 months, and that's kind of the initial duration of your ABS contract. Maybe we'll also try to create some breadcrumbs so that our depositors actually make it into your protocol if you're a DeFi ABS. So maybe we have some additional services. We have these ABSs that could enhance your protocol in some way. There's a bridge ABS that we have that's just going to make it easier for users to get around. So I think that's the kind of thinking that some of these LRTs are going to end up having, is just trying to make like a nice, full-fledged ecosystem that allows ABSs to deploy and have all the facilities that they need. And it's just like very comfortable for someone to say, yeah, I want to deploy my DeFi protocol here. I get, all the bells and whistles, and like, this is just going to be a good option for me.
Yeah, I would say on the thick side as well. I mean, just going back to the comparison of Lido, there's 2 buttons on the Lido website. One is to stake ETH, and one is to stake Matic. Pretty sure like 90+% of people click the first one. So as a staker on Lido, or a governance token holder on Lido, it would be safe to assume that they're focusing on one thing and one thing only. With these LRTs, as they vertically integrate, which can be done in a very positive way for the ecosystem, you have to start to question, is this DAO structure focusing on the staking side, the restaking side, the ABS strategy side, the yield generating side on the DeFi side? All this stuff starts to come into play, and you start to wonder, what part of the ecosystem do you exist in as maybe just a passive restaker who doesn't want to be participating in all these other auxiliary things that they're building, and who comes first in that ecosystem. And so I think that's something that you definitely have to consider when choosing an LRT versus staking ETH out of Lido.
Yeah, I think this has been mentioned on the podcast before, but it's worth kind of reiterating that there are not that many ABSs right now. And kind of all LRTs are like staking on as many ABSs as they can. But we're very early in the development of this market structure. So I think there is going to be a lot of additional infrastructure built out, ways of kind of doing this ecosystem building, or finding ways to get exclusivity on ABSs that is just not there yet.
Yeah, Sam, I want to just call out this piece that you wrote from your seat at TimeWave, and we can link it in the show notes. And I would encourage everyone to go read this. It was really eye-opening for me, because you sort of started to tease apart some of the different value proposition of there's kind of this like economic security question, which is rehypothecating the collateral from one set of operators to maybe another. And there is a discussion about whether or not that is a meme or not, or how real that really is. And then there's almost this like lending component or protocol owned liquidity component or whatever. And a clear example of where you can see this in the wild today is if you look at some of the early examples of interchain security over in Cosmos between a protocol like Stride and the Cosmos Hub, where there's this sort of consumer chain relationship, which looks more like restaking that we're talking about. But then also Stride, it's not just about making the STRD token liquid. They actually have their liquid staking protocol, and they want to be the dominant staked Atom derivative. So there's actually a really core strategic reason for why taking some of the Atom on the treasury and making it liquid should be a part of that agreement. So, that just from my perspective, that's a very tangible, real, sort of additional value proposition to everything that we're talking about, and just worth underlining and highlighting the difference there.
Totally. I worked on this Atom 2 paper, and one kind of secret there is like I was never like a huge fan of Cosmos's like idea of restaking, or just thought it was like a more or less commoditized market. I still kind of think that at the limit. But I do think so. My approach to that was like, okay, well, it's all about the value added services actually. And you either need this like technical supercomposability or economic supercomposability. Like you need to, and that is the TLDR of Atom 2 is like, you can do shared sequencer type stuff, or you can do stuff that we're doing with TimeWave, which is like protocol and liquidity. You can create base asset liquidity like immediately upon launch. You can just kind of grow this DeFi ecosystem and provide incentives for that are going to be really attractive to deploy new protocols into, and that just gives founders, I think, a lot of assurance that they're going to have a functional DeFi ecosystem. Like you need some assets there to begin with, and there's going to be users there on day one, and you can potentially do it in a kind of cost-effective way with protocol and liquidity. And we just kind of watch this play out with interchain security, and particularly during the bear market, like everyone was pretty desperate for liquidity in Cosmos, and then it was just very easy to pattern match in when Eigen Layer launched and be like, okay, well, people are like talking about how this is going to be some crazy yield uplift for ETH stakers. Like, yeah, you're going to get a big airdrop, but that's actually just not true. Like the reason that ABSs want to deploy into this is not to just give away the same amount of yield. They're going to want to they're going to get security in a cost-effective way, and then they're going to want to, like, this is their go-to-market. Actually, they want users, marketing, and liquidity. Those are like the main reasons that ABSs want to deploy into Eigen Layer. It's because Eigen Layer is like in the news every day. So if you can build tools that just directly give ABSs what they want, liquidity point systems that lead users into the usage of the ABS. And I'm quite sure there's going to be a lot of like co-marketing opportunities. Like those are things that directly serve protocol deployment, the go-to-market for an ABS.
Yeah, like Sam initially mentioned, a lot of LSTs that didn't have a lot of market share turned into LRTs. Similarly, like if you were a Cosmos chain or a chain in another ecosystem, maybe even a roll-up, depending on what you were, you sort of started transitioning into an ABS because that became the better go-to-market, with Eigen Layer sort of like getting a ton of attention.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've used this comparison on the show before, but it's sort of, this happened with roll-ups as well, where I'm not a failed L1, I'm a ETH rollup, and there was some narrative buy there. There was, I think, mechanically, actually, one of the things that's attractive about rollups is it's basically a nice little bridge for ETH and liquidity. So there are some part mechanical actual advantages, some part narrative sort of advantages. But one thing that Miles and I laid out as a theme for the season is to explore some previous iterations of shared security, like Polkadot and early attempts on Cosmos as well, and try to get an understanding of what EigenLayer has done differently. And I think there are definitely some like mechanical changes that EigenLayer has made, like Polkadot. They didn't really understand the demand profile. They they made their equivalent of AVS's parachains lock up for like 2 years. You couldn't reuse Polkadot, so there were all these mechanical things. But also you just didn't have nearly as much of the underlying asset. There wasn't as much DOT at that time, and you didn't have as many maniacal holders. And it feels like one of what's happened here with EigenLayer a little bit is, they fixed some of the actual economics of this shared security implementation, but they also just tried it on ETH, where there's a shit ton of liquidity and holders and all that kind of stuff. But
100%. Also, just leaving space in the protocol on both sides, like
right,
it's open on both sides, and creating competition on both sides, I think really helps to, all these points farms, like they are farming the Eigen token, but they're also farming the LRT token and the AVS token. So you're really just sucking capital into that system.
Yeah. And with Polkadot, you touched on the duration aspect, right? Which was kind of set at the global level, which is maybe the mistake there. But it is interesting that the demand side still wants duration requirements. And, as I think about it, if I'm a depositor, if I'm willing to keep my capital locked up in an LRT for a year or 2 years, that gives the LRT, the ability to satisfy those like demands on the AVS side. I should get paid more, right, in terms of out of the proportional yield than the depositor that says, I like this, but I want the ability to withdraw at any point in time. And right now, I think, we've touched on this before, but these very soft sort of duration agreements have been made, but there's nothing actually constraining them at the either on the LRT side or on the EigenLayer side, right? There could be some sort of time lock, contracts that are sort of canonical, right, to the marketplace. But I'm curious, does anybody have any strong opinions on really where those contracts or where those sort of requirements should live, whether it's at the LRT side or if it's global, contract set and provided by EigenLayer? And do you guys have any strong opinions on, I guess, who should, like, the level of opt-in from the user side, right? Because I think it's kind of hoping that everybody like doesn't withdraw at the same time right now, but feels like there should be some opt-in if, the LRTs are going to go out and make these sort of, commitments.
Different levels of opt-in are, I think, signs of a mature market. And I think because the market's growing so fast and it's like relatively unsophisticated, I think like if the LRTs were to add complexity to their protocol today, I think it would be worse for them in general, because most people want to see it as a black box where they park some money in and then they get more money out, right? So I think overall, like adding more complexity or more buttons, right? Like Clayton said, you stake ETH on Lido and that's it. You don't really think too hard. I think at least for now, until the market matures and like users ask for it, it seems like adding complexity makes the protocol harder to build, makes the go-to-market more complicated for users as well, and generally just seems like because the market is so young, it doesn't matter. Over time, I think we'll see some of these fixed duration things that look a lot more like VC deals, where VCs provide a scarce resource and capital to protocols. Maybe in the future, LRTs provide a scarce resource, which is security to the protocol, and they have some sort of lockup agreement where you put your ETH into the LRT protocol for a specific period of time, and then they offer that to new AVSs for that period of time, right? So like I think those things will happen over time. It's just that the market is so young that I think it doesn't make sense to add the complexity today.
Yeah, and totally. I mean, Mike, this is actually your main criticism. I really appreciated it. There's just kind of a fundamental tension right now between like what's easy and what the market wants. And kind of how you should be building these things with it, which is like, if one side of the market is asking for duration, you need to be able to like provide that guarantee by expressing that in the protocol somehow. I would hope that we can kind of back into that later. We can create like tranching systems, and to the user, it kind of looks the same, but there's like underlying machinery that the LRT is incorporating that allows you to, allows them to manage that duration or liquidity risk more effectively. If that doesn't happen, then just things are going to blow up. Like I'm relatively concerned about that. So that was kind of the point of this piece, is like to just like shop around that idea a little bit, like put it into the world so that some LRTs maybe behind the scenes like plug that in somehow. Yeah.
So
this isn't just specific to restaking protocols as well, too. I mean, I think in the early stages of any sort of network, this concept of duration is pretty prevalent pretty much everywhere. Every single protocol has some sort of foundation delegation program. There are agreements that exist off-chain for validators to be on the network for XYZ number of years, until the network is sufficiently decentralized and kind of the marketplace dynamics are pretty stable at that point. I think with the added complexity of who you want this duration from, whether it be the LRT, the operator, the strategy manager, the staker, right? The operator's not controlling the stake, etc. So that complexity, you would probably want it simplified in some way to where I think that the best thing for Eigenlayer to do is ask these ABSs like, what sort of duration do you want and from what actors, and then put some system in place and protocol where they can get it, with still acknowledging the fact that maybe LRTs may have a specific system to them for their asset and their community.
Yeah, you could also just put it in the Ethereum base layer. I mean, so the rainbow staking is kind of going in this direction a little bit. It's not doing like bonds per se, but some of the work I'm doing with the Celestia team, you could hypothetically make commitments for specific durations just as like part of the native staking commitment. It's totally possible. Having it lower level means that it's kind of accessible to a wider set of market participants. You could also potentially structure things a little bit more, be like, oh, these are the buckets of duration that we want, and like everybody's gonna kind of adhere to that. I would love to see more experimentation here.
So I would say, I know, not to be like a little bit of a Debbie Downer on this, but I think this is an unsolved problem in banking writ large, right? This isn't like an early challenge that protocols faces. This is the fundamental challenge of fractional reserve banking, which is a duration mismatch on banks' balance sheets. So I think it's sort of important to go into these sorts of things eyes wide open and say it would be really nice if, okay, I just don't think retail's ever going to, there might be some very small portion of retail liquid restakers that opt into some sort of CFD type structure, but I would guess even in a really mature market, that's a really small percentage. Maybe some institutional component of the market comes in that's more willing to do that. But even that, I would guess that even at the final end state is still like a pretty small part of the market. One thing that you might be able to do is create some sort of incentive. I think it's going to be a really hard sell ever to just get people to lock their capital up that you cannot take it out for 6 months. But you can start to tier the incentives to keep them staked during those 6 months. So here's the way that it works. At there's a very common product for businesses and commercial banks today. You can do something called a sweep. You can lock up, like all large companies do this. Some small, medium-sized businesses do this. But you can lock up a certain percentage of your bank account in short-term treasuries, and you can take that out at any given point. But if you do, you lose access to whatever the whatever it is now, 4 or 5% that you'd be getting. So again, it's not locked up, but the incentive is to keep it locked for that whatever period of time you guaranteed. And so that feels realistic to me. but I don't think we're ever going to get some sort of full lock.
I mean, Ethereum already manages duration on the validator side. There's an exit queue. So
True.
Like these things do exist. And obviously it's more institutional player, but that is a relatively simple way to modulate duration in protocol.
Guys, maybe we want to transition to some of the leverage that LRTs have. So something that, again, Miles and I have talked about actually over various seasons is the leverage that whatever part of the stack has direct access to the user or the customer. And, in a certain sense, EigenLayer as the dominant restaking platform has a lot of leverage through the amount of deposits that they control. But LRTs are sort of sliding in as this layer in between EigenLayer and end users. And now LRTs also have direct relationships with AVSs as well. So maybe we could just talk about this leverage that liquid restaking platforms have in this ecosystem.
Yeah, and I might add just one quick thing to that. So, I would say totally agree. LRTs have a huge point of leverage by owning basically the relationships with each end of the marketplace. And to EigenLayer, they see a deposit come in from a LRT, they actually don't know who that end user is, right? They have to go and ask these LRTs, hey, can you give us the addresses of the depositors? That's, I would say, part of why they were not part of airdrop season 1, right? So you've completely kind of blinded them to the end user relationship. And at the same time, we have more restaking competitors emerging right now, right? And if the relationship is really with a Renzo or an EtherFi, if I'm EigenLayer and I'm seeing Symbiotic and Babylon and even the Cosmos Hub sort of emerging, I'm probably getting a little bit worried that they're basically looking to become an aggregator, right? The AVS can get probably better deals, right? If they are if they're working with an LRT that has, access to restaking from all of these different restaking protocols, right? And so it is an interesting moment in time because that hasn't quite happened yet. And we kind of assume that these LRTs are going to be, or most of them will be agnostic. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that. And if you were in the shoes of EigenLayer, how opinionated should you be? How worried should you be? And what do you do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thing that every single protocol does have, as a weapon or a tool, is this token that they're going to release, right? So Symbiotic will likely release one. Babylon will likely release one to incentivize the stake to stay on. So there is a giant lever that EigenLayer will be able to pull, and likely, once these networks are live and there is a market for it, I think it's safe to assume that EigenLayer will be the largest, at launch in terms of valuation, and then, end result, how much, incentives they can give up by inflating their token at not an extreme amount. I will say, on the LRT side, though, specifically, I mean, and maybe this is just me living in the US or, previously working at an institutional staking provider, but the marketing that all of these LRTs had over the past year was EigenLayer, 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 EigenLayer. And, you do have these depositors that have been here, with the assumption that I put this ETH in because you were going to manage my restaking positions on EigenLayer. So potentially moving any of that stake off, at least the stuff that they have currently. But I think there's just some legal considerations there. I don't know, if there is a problem there, but I would definitely want to think about that as someone that's effectively managing people's assets, because I mean I think a good example is when Uniswap went from V2 to V3, the user had to move it over. So I feel like you would have to at least have some sort of button in the system to be able to accept this new risk reward framework, but it could get done.
Yeah, I mean, if I were EigenLayer, I would definitely be thinking about it for sure. I kind of mentioned this before, but I think there's really this technical composability and economic composability that you have to work with. You can integrate the Eigen token into your ecosystem in a meaningful way. You can deploy Eigen liquidity into your ecosystem. You can integrate specific technical architectures. I mean, Eigen DA, for instance, if there's some kind of additional composability that you get by using Eigen Layer and Eigen DA, and that could be attractive for folks. But I mean, this is why I'm doing this protocol and liquidity deployment system with TimeWave. I think that's like a major lever. You're going to want to deploy your token into this ecosystem in order to kind of create like a liquidity alliance kind of thing.
There's also this component of centralization through yield. So if EigenLayer can attract the top 5 AVSs, right? Even if LRTs wanted to move off of EigenLayer to another restaking platform, there'd just be no incentive to do it, right? So there is this component of, if you can get the best AVSs through whatever means, then it makes sense for the LRTs to continue supporting EigenLayer. On the other hand, if like the best AVSs are somewhat fragmented across different restaking platforms, then I think this role of the LRTs as strategy managers becomes even more important, because then like almost no user wants to like take their ETH, split it in half, and then move like half to Symbiotic, half to EigenLayer, and then like keep on monitoring these things over time. So if like there is some fragmentation, then the LRTs become even more powerful, and I think like they hold even more leverage over the restaking platforms, because they are sort of like holding the ETH, and like we also mentioned previously, right, that like because EigenLayer has a limited number of AVSs, the ETH doesn't have something to do the whole time. So like if now Symbiotic comes in with their own set of AVSs, then that ETH will probably also go there instead of like just becoming liquidity for EigenLayer AVSs. So there's like a lot of levers here that like different parties can pull. Obviously, like the best lever to pull is basically getting the best AVSs to come and work with you. If you do that, I think there's like basically no option but for LRTs to support you for the most part.
I think there's another dynamic here, which is, I mean, Lido and Symbiotic already have this kind of some kind of relationship with each other. I'm TBD on what exactly it looks like, but many LRTs are also trying to create relationships with L2 treasuries or DeFi treasuries to get deposits from those protocols. So, you know, this is a very different deposit base. These are folks that maybe want, you know, they do have demand for something over a larger duration. They have a larger capital base that they're working with, and maybe they actually want specific AVS functionality out of the LRT, so they kind of work with them to give them the capabilities that they need. So I can definitely imagine some kind of supply chain being created there between applications, LRTs, and the AVSs that they're working with.
There's this other component of incentives as well. Clayton mentioned that like all of these protocols probably will have tokens, and they can be used as incentives. It'll be interesting to see if any restaking platform themselves try to form relationships, exclusive relationships with these LRTs. The LRTs have the user relationship, AVS relationship, and also the TVL, right? So like if you're one of the up and coming ones, maybe it makes sense to try to like get some TVL off of EigenLayer onto your platform through like an exclusive relationship for either a part of the TVL on a liquid restaking platform or all of the TVL there. So like there's also incentives that can play out not directly to users, but like incentives that go to these protocols potentially, and maybe a percentage of those incentives flow back to users. So like that can be interesting. Obviously that has like legal implications, if like Clayton mentioned, but I feel like that is something that at least the up and coming restaking platforms will explore, if not go ahead with.
Yeah, I mean that's an important thing to mention in terms of how differentiated these LRTs can be as well, right? It's like, you know, some LRTs have mentioned that they want to give these AVS rewards, and i.e. the native token, to, you know, the wallet addresses of these depositors. that's interesting for a lot of reasons. But if I'm holding an LRT and a custodian, or restaking, without an LRT and a custodian, you have to hope that that custodian supports all of those assets, or those things are just not going to enter your wallet. So this sort of abstraction layer in the form of an LRT that, I put ETH in, I get the LRT, I want to get rid of the LRT, I get ETH back, makes, the use case for LRTs on the institutional side, or anyone that's, staking out of custody even more interesting than an LST as well.
How big do you think the institutional part of the LRT market is, out of curiosity?
0 right now. Well, not 0. But I think there's it's good to distinguish between US based institutions and large asset managers and institutions and APAC in Europe. But I think at least in America there's a lot of caution because this is just naturally complex, and like a lot of this stuff isn't laid out to where what's the reward rate, what's the risk. These are like very, very simple baseline questions that if you don't know the answer to, no institution in the US is going to deposit into. Also, the tax implications of this becomes complicated as well, right? It's like if I'm receiving all these ABS rewards and they just enter my wallet willy-nilly, like, it's taxable on receipt. But if I can't sell it because my custodian doesn't support it, I could be effectively paying more taxes than the amount of money that I'm selling these tokens for. So I mean, it's very, very simple questions that these folks would be asking, but none of these questions have been answered yet. But on the LRT side, if this concept of a strategy manager, or like this strategy manager without a receipt token, does become very, very important in terms of managing the reward rate, those people are going to go to the strategy manager and trust that the strategy manager is working with reputable node operators and has relationships with custodians and market makers, etc.
I mean, there is also like the blast kind of route, right? Like you kind of vertically integrate the L2 staking token, restaking, and then you're just, by depositing into the L2, you're in their full ABS world, that it's restaking the shared sequencer for that chain, and you're getting a little bit extra yield for that. In that case, I would assume that the institutions just support it out of the box.
Yeah, the reason I was just asking about the institutions is sometimes that word means different things to different people. That could mean like US based, blue chip, large funds. Realistically at this point, the funds that are you're not going to get like a pension fund or something like that that's looking towards this. Like realistically, you're talking about kind of blue chip, like the polychains or the paradigms or something like that. I think another large group of this market that is probably like earlier product market fit too, or just kind of like whales, and maybe like internationally based whales, like those 70 guys that live in China that used to be miners, that's like realistically the, quote, institutional segment of this market. Cause it's hard for me to see a lot of this getting through compliance teams on the US side of it. It definitely will eventually, but it's just going to take a long time.
Yeah. I mean, it's been moving. But yeah, as someone who worked at an institutional staking provider, I think when we use the term institution, it was any entity that was obligated to be in qualified custody. So then it's like making sure that function is integrated on the qualified custodian side. And so if you can't get those folks comfortable with it, you are going to, for better or for worse, depending on who you're talking to, not going to have those folks as network participants.
I mean, but to Stride, that they are a consumer chain on the Cosmos Hub. Liquid staking is the application that they provide. They are an LRT technically, because the hub is a restaking platform, and Stride, I imagine, has a path to getting institutional integration from custodians and whatnot. So you can kind of backdoor it a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's one of the value propositions of Eigen Layer being on Ethereum as well, to be honest, because if you want to cut the integration cost and the integration time by 4 or 5x, you release an ERC20 token compared to like a new layer 1 protocol.
Guys, maybe in our we can start to wind down here and touch on this last topic of multi-asset restaking. And so I think a lot of people had built their mental models for restaking and liquid restaking purely off of the existing market structure of Eigen Layer and restaked ETH. And now that we're seeing the proliferation of other or like very early days, right? But eventually we know other restaking platforms are coming to market. Some of them are ETH ecosystem based. Some of them are going to be Solana or theoretically Celestia based. And Karak has come out and said we want to support all these different assets. So I'm just curious, when you think about the introduction of being able to use other assets outside of staked ETH, I mean, how does that ultimately end up changing things?
I think having multiple assets just like expands the overall capital base. So the most naive answer would be it probably takes down cost for AVSs in terms of yield, right? If you have both Bitcoin and ETH and all other things remaining equal, now you have access to like 1.8 trillion in assets. So like some holder base will be happy to like give you their tokens for security for like 0.4% yield versus like maybe with ETH it was like 0.6. So like for an AVS, it seems like it would be strictly better, assuming security is sort of the same across everything technologically. And maybe given assets that are more stable and like less risky to hold, the yield requirement is also lower, right? Like if you have BTC, then like I'm assuming because Bitcoin has like less like or like no real yield on chain, like BTC holders are likely to like demand less yield overall, and also just because like they're happy to hold their Bitcoin for a long time, they're just like okay with taking a small amount of yield on their Bitcoin versus like ETH holders who might want slightly more because they're already getting like 3% on their ETH through staking.
There actually is a multi-asset restaking protocol on the market today, which is Terra's Alliance module.
Oh, wow.
People probably don't know about it or talk about it that much, but like it's quite cool. Basically takes liquid staked assets, which can be transported across chain in Cosmos, and brings them into the Terra Alliance module. It prices those assets. So it kind of says, I want to attract this much capital, and I'm going to taper off my rewards. And once I get close to that level, so it's much more of like a liquidity platform. But there is precedent for it today. Yeah, I do think it looks much different. We were discussing kind of prior to the call here, like the financial asset that you get out of it, if you're going to tokenize that, looks quite different. I mean, it's not indexed on one asset. It's more of this amalgam between the different LSTs that you're putting in it. But for specific use cases, if you're just interested in attracting the capital and using it more for these liquidity purposes, or you're really trying to do it in a capital efficient way, it could be quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be interesting to see what happens on Babylon specifically for Bitcoin. I mean, like less than 8% of the market cap of Bitcoin is in wrap Bitcoin or any other, derivative of Bitcoin on Ethereum. But it's also a concept between store value versus money, and does anyone want to be in the market of burning gold? I don't know. Like some people are in the market of burning money or redistributing money, but there is a lot of Bitcoin sitting on the sideline that has likely been looking for some sort of on-chain yield solution where, most of that market is off-chain and you do have to, trust a counterparty, et cetera. So, but to Crane's point, it has no natural yield, which you would then argue that this vertical integration or thickness on making relationships with Bitcoin L2s or bridging that over and creating a more unified product with the idea of like the base layer product being restaked, and that actually makes it more valuable than just non-staked Bitcoin, could be an attractive product to be offering to ecosystems.
It's an interesting thing to muse and reason about how depositors or potential restakers might actually feel about the underlying asset. Like, I just realized a lot of my mental model for this was how I feel about my ETH bag. But Krane, you just made a really interesting point, actually, that, I mean, I've kind of had this forever bag of Bitcoin that I just was never really planning on touching. And I actually feel pretty differently about my Bitcoin than I feel about my, like, just as a hypothetical scenario, a potential restaker has equal bags of USDC, Bitcoin, and ETH, and they have the opportunity to restake that in whichever way they see fit. How are the way that they conceptualize each one of these bags going to impact that? And Bitcoin had this thing working against it for a long time. I always thought in Bitcoin DeFi, it's why I was never particularly excited about it, is the mantra for Bitcoin is hodl your Bitcoin, never spend it. If you live a good life and you're buried next to your cold storage wallet, like, that was a life well lived, from the Bitcoiner's perspective. And that actually is a good fit with restaking in a sense. Like, now you can have your cake and eat it too, because you can opt into these other ecosystems while maintaining that forever bag of Bitcoin. So I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it from that angle before, but that's something that's interesting to consider.
I mean, the interesting thing with Babylon is that it does stay on the native Bitcoin network.
Right.
You really, I mean, you still do have to trust the protocol. But yeah, I mean, I guess the question to ask is, how many people are going to not do anything with their Bitcoin at all, ever? But even if that's 75%, you have $300 billion worth of an asset that can be restaked.
Yeah.
I mean, I could also see, I am going to lock up my Bitcoin for a year. I want it forever. I'll lock it up for a year, and I'll just get a voucher for, like, I'm not going to get a liquid token. I'll just get a deposit receipt. That could work.
Yeah, there's some evidence the Bitcoiners love BlockFi. There are little bits of evidence that suggest Bitcoiners love BlockFi. Ordinals have been relatively successful. I bet that number is higher than you'd think. I bet it's higher than 25%. But, to your point, even 25% is almost the entire market cap of Ethereum. So there you go. Guys, I think we've got to wind down here. This was a phenomenal discussion from my standpoint. Thank you so much, each of you, for coming on and walking us through this. Clayton, Sam, Krane, what is the best way for folks to either follow you, stay in touch with the work you're doing, anything like that? Everyone's always Sam.
Yeah,
can you lead us
I'm
off?
I'm on Twitter at HXRTS, and you can find Skip and Time Wave through that. So I'd encourage you to look there.
You can find me on 0x Krane, Krane, also on Twitter.
I am Menzel _ Clayton, which is my name in reverse. And you can find me at Rio and Figment Capital, which are both linked in my bio.
Excellent. Guys, this was a phenomenal discussion. Really appreciate all of you coming on. And yeah, we'll have to do something like this again sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.